Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 475. All right, guys, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise awareness of trauma and to support new trauma therapists just starting out on their trauma-informed journey. I do that through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. If you're a therapist of any kind, interested in learning about trauma, and you're looking for support and inspiration, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, let's get started. This episode is sponsored by cptsdfoundation.org. And one of the great things about, for me, about doing this podcast is that I get to speak to and work with amazing people. And Athena Moberg, the CEO and founder of cptsdfoundation.org, is one of those individuals. This woman is on fire. I got to meet her several months ago here in San Francisco. We had breakfast together and just had a really great talk. And I got to learn about her foundation and what they're doing. They provide complex trauma survivors and practitioners with compassionate support, skills, and trauma-informed education. Athena works together with expert practitioners and treatment centers, offering daily touch points to anyone currently in trauma therapy or who wants a safe place to come, feel heard and validated between therapy appointments. Some of the resources they offer are daily recovery support, a healing book club. They have free support groups. They also offer this really cool thing where they can send you texts just to encourage you and help you heal on your journey. So check them out at cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast. Once again, that's cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast. All right, folks, a giant thank you to my sponsor for making this podcast happen, Brighter Vision. You know, when you're in private practice, it can be tough just to find the time to review your marketing efforts, let alone make improvements where they're needed. Whether you're a seasoned clinician whose current website needs to be revamped or a new therapist building a website for the first time, Brighter Vision is there to help. By first understanding your business and what makes it unique, Brighter Vision's team of developers then uses this information to create a custom website catered to your specific marketing goals. Better yet, all of their websites also include free, unlimited technical support so that you can continue to build your brand online with minimal time or effort. And the best news of all, Trauma Therapist Podcast listeners get your first month entirely free just for listening today. That's right. So head on over to brightervision.com/guy. Once again, that's brightervision.com/guy. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Here we go again. I am very excited to have as my guest, Nina Tara. Nina, welcome.
And welcome. Thank you. Yes, thank you for having me here.
All right. I'm excited. So Nina is a multidisciplinary art psychotherapist who runs and operates Courageous Art Therapy in London, England. She's worked in the creative field for many years, and art has always been an integral part of her life. Nina originally trained as a designer and still designs and illustrates book covers. In addition to this, Nina works with adults, children, and families. She offers art therapy for individuals impacted by trauma, emotional and behavioral difficulties, bereavement, end-of-life issues, and changes in family structure. All right, Nina, obviously just a little bit about you. But first, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're currently located, and then we'll get going.
I've always been in London. My parents migrated in the 70s from Africa, so I was born here. Okay. So I've really always been based in the UK. I've always been based in London. I moved to Oxford and Swindon for a little bit of time to study, and then I returned back to London. It always had that pull for me to be near a family.
Okay. So, I think we'd be remiss in neglecting to mention the craziness that's going on with this outbreak and everything. First of all, how are you doing?
Yeah, I think like many of us, we're having moments of grief, and it's like a global collective grief as well, and our own griefs, and so it's kind of navigating that and also adapting work to become more online and still be accessible for our clients, and actually learning new ways to be present. So yeah, no, it's challenge, and I think you can either go one or two ways. You can either be overwhelmed by it, or you can use it as a platform to actually springboard into something a little bit more challenging and more vulnerability. And that's really where I am. I'm kind of using this as a springboard because it's quite an unusual set of circumstances, and all the training that we've done has never really allowed us to explore this. So in many ways, we're kind of pioneering a new way to practice. So that kind of excites me as well.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of start. I mean, I want to kind of get into those specifics you mentioned there. But before we do, how did you get into this field first and foremost?
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. My journey started about 9 years ago. I lost my mum. My mum passed away. She had renal failure, and she also had dementia. So we'd been taking care of her for some time, but unfortunately she became too ill. And actually this kind of propelled me on in my own grief and overwhelm. I kind of became consumed by that as well. But also at the same time, it really propelled me into like a sort of a journey of personal development. And I was really impacted by panic attacks and overwhelm, and I was really struggling with the whole concept of grief and loss. And in that space, I kind of it came across Lee Balcomb's podcasts, Thriveology, and I kind of clung on to those. And actually, that for me then became another way to kind of manage my symptoms, if you like, and also think outside of myself. And then from then I began to volunteer for the Alzheimer's Society because, as I said, my mum had dementia. And it changed a lot for me. It changed a lot for me to think about someone else other than just myself. And from there, I eventually started to discover art therapy a little bit. I didn't really know because I'd been working as a designer for such a long time. And at the same time all of this was happening, there was the crisis, the refugee crisis, that was unfolding as we were watching all the people being displaced. And at that time, I started to do some fundraising for a small charity called Art Refuge UK. They provide psychosocial support for refugees. And they were doing a lot of work in Calais. They were trying to get a pilot program off the ground. So I started some fundraising. We did some art sales. We did some online art sales. Managed to raise a fair amount of money, actually, and really, really help support their work. And they invited me to come out to Calais with them. And it was at the most turbulent time. And it was actually when the camps were being dismantled by the police. There were tear gas canisters going everywhere. It was quite an extraordinary experience. And it changed my life from there. And I think that's when I really started to sort of tune into the fact that I wanted to retrain. And art psychotherapy was what was calling to me at that time. So, I kind of worked really, really hard to save some money because with a family as well, it's not going to be easy to retrain at a later stage in life. And I managed to go for various foundation courses, never gave up, and continued. And this is where I am now.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that personal story, and sorry for your loss with your mom.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
You talked about that experience in Calais that was life-changing. What specifically about that was life-changing for you?
I think just witnessing and being amongst so many people that were impacted by trauma, but not really in a space to be able to process their trauma. So it was like a holding space, and actually how valuable those holding spaces can be as well. And actually that's what comes to my mind now at the moment, where we're impacted by all this trauma global trauma going on. And that's really what it is about, creating holding spaces. and seeing how much of a change that can make for someone. And, you know, having a connection with another human being when, you know, we're working with young unaccompanied minors who were lost without family. They'd literally lost their families along the way. And here they were trying, you know, they were I called them the lost boys because they were having to grow up really, really fast and in complete survival mode. And to exist like that for such a long time had such an impact on them. And they weren't really going to be able to process their trauma until they reached a safe space.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of really made me think even deeper about how we work as human beings and how we survive and how we process. And so, yeah, and actually made me think a lot about my own personal things and traumas, and really made me want to retrain and also really fully dive into my personal therapy, because as a art psychotherapist, you have to have compulsory personal therapy. And it, you know, usually when you're in therapy, when I've been in therapy, because I have taken therapy over the years for various things, I've always held myself back. But there's something with art therapy that's you know, so powerful, because you're processing unconscious material, and because it becomes externalized from you, it becomes safer to be able to process it.
All right. Well, I want to talk about that, but there's first there's a lot here, and I really appreciate you sharing your story and your evolution. There's just something so inspiring to me to hear someone like yourself talk about, you know, the events that happened in the wake of your mom's death and your own personal struggle, your journey, and then you get to this point where you're like, just greatly impacted by this event, working with these refugees. Nina, walk us through what happened. How did things unfold after that time, after that event and experience, such that you were like, this is what I want to do?
Yeah. I was already taking a foundation course in well-being and therapies at the university that I went on to study my master's degree in. So I was already doing a short foundation course whilst I went with Art Refuge to Calais. And then returning from that was it. I knew I needed to kind of carry on to pursue my MA, because I wasn't even sure at that point I was going to do it. I wanted to tap into something to see if it fitted nicely, if I could fit into this space, and if that fit in with my space. But I just think, you know, the realization that so many people suffer on a daily basis with trauma and various emotional difficulties. And if in any way, by training, you know, I could make some kind of difference in that situation for them, or some kind of, you know, holding space for them in that situation. And it became quite important. It became really, really important for me to kind of carry on pursuing it. And after the foundation course, I did another short foundation course, and then I went on to apply for an MA, because I didn't have a degree or anything, so I didn't easily fit into the criteria. So I had to do a lot of voluntary hours, and I can't remember how many voluntary hours was. So I really had to work very hard to actually be able to get onto the MA course.
There's a difference, though, between someone who's, you know, going through a struggle of any type, and then they get to a point where they're like, not only do I want to help people in a particular situation, in this case, people who've suffered with trauma, but this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
How did that kind of progression, what was that like for you?
I think it wasn't overnight. It was it was a good 2 years, I think, as I kind of sort of discovered. And actually, the first time I read an art therapy article, I got really frightened. I was like, "Oh my God, this work is so intense. How can I even imagine myself doing that? How can I actually imagine myself carrying that weight of that work?" And I think actually a lot of that was down to the course we were in, and how they were guiding us as well, and what we were learning. And I think in my own personal therapy and my supervision, I learned how to be completely vulnerable and be open about making mistakes, and owning them as well, and going back and making repairs. So it took a good number of years for me to get to the point where I was really, really open to all of the experiences that I was about, that I was going to experience. And even then in placement, sometimes we can resist the challenge of, the counter-transference and the transference, and what that means. We can resist that, but that's where the biggest learning is, I think.
So a little while ago, you mentioned the power, in a sense, of art therapy. Talk about that. Why is that? How is that so powerful?
I actually have no idea. I can only speak from my own personal experience and my own personal art therapy. I'm a wonderful art therapist. And I chose deliberately to have an art therapist, because I thought, if I'm going to be doing this, I need to know what it feels like. And I still see her, actually. Even after finishing training, I still sort of see her once a month. And it's always surprised me that something, I'll be talking about something random and I'll be making while I'm talking. And then all of a sudden something will be on that piece of paper, or it'll be made out of clay, or it'll be out of whatever material I'm using. And it will just resonate so deeply that you cannot ignore it, that you just cannot unsee it. And then, there's even been a time when I made something out of clay that it just sort of suddenly looked like something. And I dropped what I was making because it resonated so deeply. And I think there's also a playfulness, I think, in the art making. There's the play, because we're not coming from, the conscious mind. We're coming, from the bottom up process. And that can feel like a safer way to process something quite difficult. And that, for me, has always been, I think, the most powerful thing. And also having that witness. And as I said before, when it's externalized, having that safe thing of being able to talk about something that's outside of yourself, that's not you, that it can be outside, that you can talk about something that's outside.
I'm wondering if there's an example of maybe someone you worked with that you can share with us.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, because I normally don't do this, but I want to do it with you, because I think it can be very powerful. And obviously you don't have to use names and whatever, but I think if we can maybe create a picture, if you will, it might be helpful.
Yeah. The most powerful work I've ever done with art therapy has been in the hospice environment with end-of-life patients. And I had to really think very carefully about the kind of materials that I was taking to the bedside. So I would use something called model magic. It's like a clay material, but it's clean. And it's a material that asks for the least when you're working with adults. There's no overwhelm with, what should I do with paints? And often patients weren't able to sit up. They were often laying down because they were so unwell. And in this particular case study, I was working with a 54-year-old lady, and she'd been impacted by cancer, and she was pretty much end of life. And we worked with this material. And in the working with this material, she actually started to replicate her cancer. And in the working with it, she was able to hold it and almost like cradle it as well, and then sit down. And then we talked I actually asked the question, and I think that's the thing with working in a hospice environment. It pushes you to take more risks, to ask the questions, because you may not be able to ask them again. So
it pushes who? You as a therapist or the client?
Yeah, okay. No, me as a therapist, because every session was a beginning, middle, and an end.
Right.
Because I never knew if I was going to see the patient for a week, if they were going to be, one, discharged, or two, if they were going to decline and pass away. So on this occasion, I did ask her, and I said, "What would your cancer like to say to you?" And she talked to the cancer, and she actually talked back to the cancer, and she had a huge dialogue. We spent a good, I think, about 2 hours working together, and she actually dialogued with the cancer at how angry she was with it, and how she didn't ask for it to be in her body, and she wanted it to go away. And it was an incredibly powerful session for her to be externalizing something that she was really being impacted by, that she couldn't see, but she knew it was destroying her. And then at the same time to be able to take her anger and rage out on it. We worked together, I think, another 2 times. We had 3 sessions. And in that, we went through it almost like all the kind of processes of grief. And in the end, there was a kind of acceptance of some sort, because we were playing with it playfully. She was throwing balls at it, and we were trying to destroy it. And then she had a magic wand, because I used to take natural materials in as well. And so, yeah, that's really how powerful it was for her to be able to externalize something that was destroying her. Was incredibly powerful, very moving for me as well to be part of that process.
Yeah, I mean, that's really powerful. Just to think of that, and what I'm getting is the externality, the tangible quality, like you said, of having something kind of outside of oneself to do whatever with. I mean, that is very intense, and I love the way you articulated that. Moving along that same line, what would you share in terms of like an early clinical error? When you were just starting out, and what you learned from that?
Yeah, I made so many. I made so many. I think the one that comes to my mind again is from the hospice environment. And I think it was in my 3rd year, actually, my 3rd year placement. It was also the hospice that my mum passed away in. So it brought a lot, and there was a lot of healing in there, as well as learning and closure. So it was really difficult to not become a visitor at the bedside. And that was one of the things I struggled with a lot, because people are often in their pajamas and stuff. And so on this occasion, I was working with a gentleman, and I was lucky enough to work with him for quite a while, because he was in the first time he was in for symptom control. And so this is when I was working with him, when he was in for symptom control, and he'd been given his terminal diagnosis. And he was really overcome with the support that he was getting from all the members of staff. And as a celebration, he wanted to collect our numbers so he could post or text things to us. And I remember actually sitting there looking at him saying, well, this is against protocol. And at the same time, I had his mobile phone in my hand as I was tapping in my phone number. And it was like, and I knew at the time, but I was saying it's against protocol, but I was, doing completely the opposite. And as I walked away, my stomach started to churn. And I went in meeting with my managers, and they were all talking, and I just had to put my hand up, and I said, I think I've made the biggest mistake. And they were really, really, really so gentle with me. And we really explored in that time what that was, the countertransference and the transference, and really sort of held me quite well. That team, held me quite well. And, the solution was to actually go back and say, we can't do that. I'm really, really sorry. I can't give you my personal phone number. And my manager was quite happy to do it. And I thought, well, no, actually, I do need to do this, because this is a repair. I need to repair this as well, and I can't send somebody else on my behalf. And actually, it really strengthened the therapeutic relationship, because I did return, and I did go back and say, no, I can't give you my mobile phone number, but we can work this through in other sessions as we think about it more deeply, what the need is for that, and what my need was to give you my mobile phone number. And offer an equal space, because I think that's the other thing in a hospice environment. Patients are often having so much done to them, they often lose their voice. And it's really, really important for me to have a sense of equalness and offer the therapy as opposed to impose it on them. So this created a really important space for us to repair and to look at something a little bit deeper. So that was the biggest clinical error I think I ever made, amongst all the others.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking to myself, I mean, if there's ever a time to bend or break protocol when someone's at their deathbed, that might be the appropriate time.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't have been surprised if you said, well, yes, even though this is against protocol, in this setting, I'm going to allow you to text me.
Yeah.
But so talk a little bit about that. I mean, that's kind of what's coming up for me here. And
it is difficult. It is very difficult. And I think in the hospice environment, there are things that are so different in the therapeutic alliance than there are in other therapeutic alliances. For instance, in hospice environment, sometimes there was no art making. Sometimes there was me just helping them meditate. And there were often times when patients really didn't want to be seen, but, because nothing else was working, it would be send the art therapist in. And really the medicine there was just to be heard and to be seen and to be witnessed. And sometimes I'd end up making the art, so I'd become the third hand, and I would end up making something with the model magic that would resonate with someone. And so there were times when rules were, flexible. But I think there's something really, really important about keeping some boundaries, because it can be so easy to lose yourself in certain environments. And I think by holding on to some of the boundaries, I think the work can be more effective and also held in a better space. So yeah, there were times when often, working with a client and then working with family members as well at the same time, that was something different as well that I hadn't experienced, because it was either working with a client and no other work with the family members because there was a cross. But often we would do that because everybody's been impacted by what's happening. So after I'd seen a patient, and I'd go and see a family member and sit with them and hold their grief and then carry on with the work that way. So there are spaces where it can change.
You mentioned that. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just think it was really, really important for me to hold it in a more, sort of boundaried way.
Right. You mentioned that it was difficult or challenging sometimes to avoid the pull to be the visitor at the bedside.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, I think because in a hospital or a hospice environment, when the patient is at bedside, you immediately go in. I'm going to own it because it was me. I used to immediately go in, and I think also because some of the times you're not just doing the art making, you're often taking on a nurse role as well. So you'll be assisting them with any of the needs. If the patients used to be sometimes vomiting, so I'd often be there with the bowl, and so assisting them in that way.
Wow.
And so there is a real blurring of what we need, and it became really important to be whatever that person needed at that time. So I think that for me used to, at the beginning, at the start of when I was working at the hospice, became really confusing because it was like I couldn't boundary, I couldn't hold it. And then over the weeks, I suddenly realised actually it's so different from working in a one room. That's also the contained space, and then you have your materials, and it's quite structured. And to actually have my art materials that were in a little box with me, so that became my contained space. My box became my room that I would then take to the patient, and also be able to offer them whatever they needed, as well as letting them know it was a confidential space. And that's the other thing. There are very few confidential spaces in a ward because all you have is a curtain to do that with. So yes, it's quite a challenge to take the textbook art therapy rules and sort of rip them up a little bit and reassemble them into that setting and what was going to work in that setting, and allow myself to be a bit more flexible in what I'd learned and to where I was and what I was being asked to do. And I was loving the work. I loved the work in the hospice.
What do you think, Nina, it is about you, it is about yourself that allows you to work with people who've been traumatized, with people at end of life?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think I always I bring it back to myself. I bring it back to where I've been and who's helped me and where I've reached to. And again, with my own personal therapy, as I said, over the years, I've had many therapists. I've always been really, really happy to explore that. I've always had talk therapy. But yes, I've always looked to the people that have inspired me, even with one little word or one little something that's kind of made that shift for me, that I've then been able to propel myself into another space. And I think, if that's possible for anyone to do, then it's a sort of a privilege, really, to be there with someone if they let you follow, be in that space with them. And I think it's a really privileged place to be. So that's awesome. Really what brings me back to continuing this work, is just even if one little thing can make a difference for someone else to gather themselves up enough to make that change for themselves. That's really what propels me.
You're inspiring. You got me thinking about wanting to do art therapy.
Oh, yeah, great. We can do it on Zoom now, can't we?
That'll be our next episode.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So Nina, how about a go-to book recommendation, whether
I have
related or not, or
I have
whatever?
Two, actually. This was one of the first ones that I read when I first.
Oh yeah, okay.
And it's one of my favorites, and it's one that I always dive into. It's so beautifully written, and it's so easy to digest. So this is one of my favorites, Dibs in Search of Self. Okay. And the other one that I love, and I read this for my own personal reading, really, is called The Family Crucible. And it's so fascinating because it's, again, it's so beautifully written. It's hard, to put it down. And it's really about family dynamics and how we all get assigned specific roles in our lives. And that's why it was for my own personal reading. And in the reading of this, it's really helped me throughout many of my relationships, whether they're clinical setting, whether they're peer group settings, whether they're family settings, and to really look outside of myself to see, hang on, where's the dynamic here? What's being played out here? What are we being assigned here? What am I assigning to someone else? So that's been a really, really good book for me as well. I've enjoyed reading that. So those are my two go-to books.
All right. So Dibs in Search of Self and The Family Crucible. I'll have both of those linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com, as well as Nina Tara's contact information. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you, Nina?
Through my website, www.courageousart.co.uk.
Okay. Awesome. Well, it's been a delight. Like I said, you really are inspiring. I'm like, just the way you articulated the effectiveness of what art therapy is and can do, especially within the context of working with trauma, really got me going. So it was a pleasure talking with you today.
No, honestly, Guy, I wouldn't have been able to be this comfortable if it wasn't you talking to me. I think you're kind of bringing that all out of me.
Well, I appreciate that. Stay well in these crazy times.
And you too. Stay safe.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
All right, folks, a giant thank you to my sponsor for making this podcast happen, Brighter Vision. When you're in private practice, it can be tough just to find the time to review your marketing efforts, let alone make improvements where they're needed. Whether you're a seasoned clinician whose current website needs to be revamped or a new therapist building a website for the first time, Brighter Vision is there to help. By first understanding your business and what makes it unique, Brighter Vision's team of developers then uses this information to create a custom website catered to your specific marketing goals. Better yet, all of their websites also include free, unlimited technical support so that you can continue to build your brand online with minimal time or effort. And the best news of all, Trauma Therapist podcast listeners get your first month entirely free just for listening today. That's right. So head on over to brightervision.com/guy. Once again, that's brightervision.com/guy. This episode is sponsored by cptsdfoundation.org. And one of the great things about, for me, about doing this podcast is that I get to speak to and work with amazing people. And Athena Moberg, the CEO and founder of cptsdfoundation.org, is one of those individuals. This woman is on fire. I got to meet her several months ago here in San Francisco. We had breakfast together and just had a really great talk. And I got to learn about her foundation and what they're doing. They provide complex trauma survivors and practitioners with compassionate support, skills, and trauma-informed education. Athena works together with expert practitioners and treatment centers, offering daily touch points to anyone currently in trauma therapy or who wants a safe place to come, feel heard and validated between therapy appointments. Some of the resources they offer are daily recovery support, healing book club. They have free support groups. They also offer this really cool thing where they can send you texts just to encourage you and help you heal on your journey. So check them out at cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast. Once again, that's cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast.